You kneel in confession. The priest doesn't ask if you sinned. He asks exactly how. Where your hands went, what you imagined, how often you returned to it. And you are expected to answer, because this is not a conversation between two people, it is a system. Freiburg and Breisgau, southwestern Germany, 1298. Inside the Dominican convent on the edge of the city, a friar named John has just finished a book. Not a sermon, not a prayer book, a manual. One that tells a confessor exactly what to ask the person kneeling in front of him, and exactly how to judge every answer. John of Freiburg called it the Summa Confessorum. The Church would copy it for the next 2 centuries. To understand why this book existed, you have to go back 80 years. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council issued a decree that changed the interior life of every Christian in Europe. Annual confession was no longer optional. It was mandatory. That single decision created a problem the Church had not fully prepared for. Priests now needed to know what to ask, how to ask it, and how to judge what they heard. And most of them had no framework to do it. So across Europe, the Church began producing tools, confession manuals. These books were not sermons. They were checklists, organized, hierarchical, precisely structured. They divided sin into broad moral categories: pride, greed, anger, envy, sloth. But among the most detailed sections in nearly every manual were those dealing with a single subject: sex. Not whether you had sinned, that was almost assumed. What mattered was how, with whom, in what manner, and how often. John of Freiburg's Summa lays this out without ambiguity. The confessor is directed to determine intention, consent, repetition, whether the act was performed alone or with another, and if with another, their marital status, their relation to you, whether they were forbidden. Nothing left vague. Vagueness was a failure of the system. The logic behind this was coherent, on its own terms. You cannot assign appropriate penance without fully understanding the sin. A thought was not the same as an act. A solitary act was not the same as one involving a spouse, a stranger, a relative, or a member of the clergy. Each category carried a different weight, and each weight had a corresponding consequence. Days of fasting, weeks of abstinence, sometimes years. In more serious cases, a consequence that followed you, in a community where nothing stayed private. The questions in the manuals followed a strict structure. Did you act from desire or from habit? Did you attempt to resist? Did you initiate or comply? Did you enjoy it? Did you think about it afterward, seek it out again? Even a thought that lingered too long could be examined. Even a dream, if the pleasure was entertained willingly, recalled, returned to, fell within the manual's scope. The manual did not draw a clean line between action and intention. It pursued both. And here is where the system becomes something more interesting than simple punishment. Over time, people began to internalize the questions. You did not wait for the annual confession to begin examining yourself. You started asking in the dark, alone, before you even knew what you had done. What was that? Was it wrong? How wrong? The priest was no longer necessary for the examination to begin. The system had moved inside. And a system that operates from within does not need enforcement from without. That is where the power actually was. If you're starting to see how this system didn't just regulate behavior, but rewired how people understood themselves, that pattern doesn't end here. And it doesn't end with this century either. But the manuals were not enforced uniformly. That is the part the official record does not show. Not every confessor used them the same way. Some followed them strictly, others adapted, added questions, pressed harder. Because the manuals were guides, not ceilings. And in a small parish where the priest had known you since childhood, knew your family, your marriage, your debts, there was no anonymity behind the screen. Only two people who both understood exactly what was being discussed. That intimacy, forced and structured as it was, created its own kind of power. The Summa Confessorum was not the beginning of this. Centuries earlier, Irish and Welsh monks had compiled the earliest penitentials, handbooks of penance organized by sin and penalty, spread across the continent through Carolingian reform. Some texts became astonishingly specific in their categories of acts and circumstances. Scholars who study these texts note that the categories themselves were generative. By naming acts, the Church did not simply condemn them. It created the framework through which people understood those acts. Before the manual asked the question, many people had no category for the experience. After it, they did. And categories, once installed, are very difficult to remove. But to understand how precise these systems became, you have to look at what came before John of Freiburg. 2 centuries earlier, a bishop named Burchard of Worms compiled his own manual, the Corrector, completed around 1023. And it is in some ways even more revealing than the Summa. Burchard's questions were not abstract. They were drawn from what confessors actually heard. And what they heard tells you something the official church record does not, that in the early 11th century, the line between Christianity and older belief was still blurred in ways Rome found alarming. The Corrector asked whether a woman had mixed herbs into her husband's food to bind his love to her, whether she had used the days of the liturgical calendar to perform rituals the church had not authorized, whether she had sought knowledge from women who claimed to see what others could not. Each question carried a prescribed penance, 10 days, 40 days, sometimes years. The manual was not just a record of sin, it was a record of what people were actually doing. And that distinction matters, because a system that has to ask about something, specifically, carefully, with a penance already prepared, is a system that knows the behavior exists. The church was not inventing fears, it was cataloging a world it could not fully control. That is why these manuals survive as historical documents worth studying. Not because they tell you what the church believed, but because, buried in the questions, you can still see the outline of the people answering them. There was also a gap between the manual's ambition and the confessor's ability to execute it. Formal theological training and Latin proficiency varied widely across rural parishes. The Summa was written for trained Dominican friars and theologians, not for every village priest improvising in a timber church. The Dominican and Franciscan orders helped fill this gap, but their reach was uneven. In many places, the manual existed in theory. In practice, the local priest improvised. And what he improvised told you as much about him as it did about the system. Despite all of this, the specificity, the compulsion, the absence of anonymity, the real consequences. People did not only come because they had to. Over time, they came because the system had become a form of organization, a language for experiences that had no other language, a structure for guilt, for desire, for confusion, for acts that had no name in ordinary life. The confession provided an answer to questions people were already asking internally. It just answered them in the church's terms. And a system that answers the questions you were already asking, even coercively, even imperfectly, is a system that survives. That is the paradox the manuals leave behind. They were built to control. They became something people relied on, not because the system was gentle, but because it was precise, because it took seriously, in its own distorted way, the interior life of the people it governed. In a world with little science, little privacy, and almost no other language for the body and its desires, precision had power, even when it cut. Today, the structure feels familiar even when the setting does not. Systems that categorize behavior, that define what is normal, that ask you to account for yourself. The setting has changed. The instinct has not always. The confession manual was not an aberration. It was an early and unusually legible version of something that keeps returning. A reminder that the line between guidance and control is thinner than it appears from the inside. There are more systems like this, quieter ones, more normalized, And once you understand the structure, you start recognizing it in places you weren't supposed to look. If that kind of history stays with you, there's more waiting.